Alright, there's two movie reviews to get to, one positive, one negative, so obviously I'll need more time for the negative one. Therefore, let's tackle Spider-Man first in the open, and we'll leave the Matrix for the main segment. Also, if you're a regular viewer, you will already know I'm not a believer in spoiler and non-spoiler reviews, so if you want a spoiler-free review, here it is. Spider-Man good, Matrix bad. So this is your fair warning. If you don't want to find out what happens in either of these films, if you don't want to know that Tobey Maguire and Andrew Garfield both show up, or that Aunt May dies in the third act, then stop watching this video about 10 seconds ago. I thoroughly enjoyed Spider-Man No Way Home. They used up every last bit of the clock, but at long last, Marvel made a movie in the year 2021 that is actually good. And yes, I know I gave a grudgingly positive review to Black Widow, but even still, let's face it, if we're ranking every picture in the MCU in descending order of quality, there aren't going to be many names on the list below that one. And I saw Shang-Chi finally a few weeks ago, but I didn't review it because there's nothing to review. It's a paint-by-numbers entry from Marvel Phase 4, or the woke Marvel era, as I sometimes call it. In the woke Marvel era, there is always a guy fighting a girl within the first 5 minutes of the piece, and male characters exist to be emasculated by, embarrassed by, subservient to, and less powerful than their female counterparts, and Shang-Chi was no different. Even though a male character has his name on the poster, the movie is all about how Shang-Chi's sister is the bestest ever, and how his platonic girl best friend also learns to be the bestest ever. So, by the end of the movie, Shang-Chi is just sort of an afterthought who rides around on a dragon in the background while the sister and the best friend do all of the meaningful ass-kicking. Also, am I the only one who noticed that the kid who plays the title character in that picture looks exactly like freaking Xi Jinping? Very subtle, Disney. Subtle and classy. And if that's the reason why the Chinese Communist Party decided to ban the movie from being shown in their country, if the actual reason was, we cannot reward this kind of brown nosing, then that's great. I still haven't seen The Eternals. Don't have any plans to see it. I have heard not a single favorable thing about it, so I don't think I'm missing much. One day, maybe I'll check to see if there's an intersex fist fight in the first 5 minutes just to see if my theory holds, but maybe not. So Marvel made it 13 years, 20-odd films, close to 30 now, I think, before they wound up shitting out one that was so bad I didn't even bother with it. And as we know, things are even worse over on Marvel streaming TV, where it's like each series seems to inch ever closer to making the whole brand fall off the cliff of woke unwatchability. I liked WandaVision. I gave a tepidly favorable review to Falcon and Winter Soldier, but you could feel the woke creeping in. I struggled to get through Loki, the only purpose of which was to gender swap and humiliate a prominent male character from the movies. And now we're on Hawkeye, which I gave up on after less than 2 episodes. But I hope Jeremy Renner is getting paid well for having his balls ritualistically amputated by a 20-year-old girl. The point being, when the trend lines are all pointing in a certain direction, and it's a direction that ain't good, one doesn't expect a really good, enjoyable film to suddenly pop up, but the new Spider-Man picture, I thought it was just delightful. But you know what's weird? When you're consciously aware of it, when a movie is refraining from beating you over the head with identity politics, because you've become so accustomed to such things, watching all 3 of the cinematic Spider-Men performing together, playing off each other, it was a real treat, I thought. The actors seemed to be invested in it. They seemed to be enjoying themselves. It does take a minute to get used to 46-year-old Tobey Maguire when you haven't seen that guy in 15 years, but once I said to myself, hey, idiot, he's a year younger than you, so stop gawking. Then I got over it. I do want to put in a good word, though, for the one live-action Spider-Man who was sadly not present for these proceedings, that being Nicholas Hammond, the star of the late 70s Spider-Man TV show, which, if you were a male child of a certain age, you used to watch that show every single day. We know Hammond is still alive and he's still working because he was just in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood a couple years ago, playing the director of the Western show that Rick Dalton guest stars on. And he seems to be reasonably spry enough for a gentleman in his late 60s Yeah, you could have him wear the same suit from the TV show to distinguish him from the other guys, and if that doesn't work, hell, just have him wear some black socks and Bermuda shorts on the outside of his Spider-Man suit. And they line up for the big glory shot where the four of them all swing off the top of the Statue of Liberty, but Hammond's web comes up short, and he slips and falls to his death. Then the other three guys have to win the fight in honor of their late geriatric colleague. But he probably would have been dead soon anyway. Maybe fatally wounded in battle by his Asiatic supervillain nemesis, Colonel Kung Flu. From high atop the battlements of Castle Curmudgeon, where I'm proud to report I'm soon going to be attending the Keanu Reeves School of Aging, so feel free to look me up when I'm a 57-year-old hipster douchebag who looks indistinguishable from a 35-year-old hipster douchebag. Good evening, Mr. and Mrs. America, and all ships at sea. Welcome to the program. I'm your eponymous host and humble servant. I trust everyone's Christmas went agreeable. Probably the last holiday season we will ever be able to traverse state borders without showing our identity papers, so I hope you got the most out of it. Now, this Spider-Man picture and this Matrix picture, they are both exercises really in the same thing, and it's fan service. But while the Spider-Man picture succeeds in serving the fandom in a pretty gratifying way, in addition to being a good film, the Matrix picture succeeds only in being unable to decide whether it wants to pander to the fans or just mock them. Hollywood's been telling us, and their little lapdogs in the shill-tastic entertainment press have been telling us too. For nearly 2 entire years they've been telling us that movie attendance hasn't recovered because people are just so gosh darn afraid of that Chinese flu virus from China. And they say this while their industry continues to churn out some of the most risible codswallop in the history of moving pictures. It's almost become a matter of conventional wisdom that perhaps the era of the billion-dollar box office take is over. But then, hey, what's this? A film comes along that doesn't try to browbeat its audience with leftist politics. It treats beloved characters with respect. Nobody gets race-swapped or gender-swapped. There aren't any ridiculous intersex fight scenes. And would you look at that? It pops a $570 million opening. But it's weird that Marvel Studios, in the middle of what has looked for all the world like an inexorable slide into the sewer of wokesterism, would all of a sudden put out a picture that's more akin to the sort of picture they were making back when they built the MCU into the most profitable movie brand in the history of cinema. So wouldn't it be so very ironic if we are now living in a bizarre parallel universe where Sony actually saved Marvel from itself? As everybody knows, Sony owns the cinematic rights to the Spider-Man character, and there's been an agreement in place since Civil War in 2016 where they rent him to Marvel Studios so he can appear in the Avengers movies and whatnot. But the actual Spider-Man pictures, the home trilogy, if you will, those are co-productions between Marvel and Sony, so although the events of the narrative are taking place in the Marvel Universe, both studios are participating in the creative process and they both wield executive authority. Now, back around 2010, Sony was at a crossroads with Spider-Man. The Tobey Maguire trilogy had ended a few years prior. A fourth picture in that continuity was supposed to be made. It was very nearly made, but ultimately it fell through. While over at Marvel Studios, which was not yet owned by Disney, they were midway through the set of films that they hoped would do well enough that it would justify making an Avengers movie in 2012. So Sony, at that point, they can either rent Spider-Man out to Marvel Studios and have him appear in the MCU, or they can keep him in-house and start up a whole new trilogy, which they, of course, did, with Andrew Garfield in the lead role, and they made 2 movies that were fair to middling at best and god-awful at worst. By the second one, The Amazing Spider-Man 2, nobody was happy with the direction of things, but they were going to soldier on anyway. They were going to make a third film in that continuity, which they hoped, quite irrationally as it turns out, would launch a whole Spider-Man cinematic universe to rival the one over at Marvel Studios. And this plan lasted right up until Andrew Garfield got himself fired for not showing up at some meet and greet with all the studio big shots. So there's no third movie, no cinematic universe. But meanwhile, things look like they're going pretty well over at Marvel Studios. They've made 2 Avengers movies now. They're practically printing their own money, and they're about to start production on Captain America Civil War, so maybe we should call up Kevin Feige and gauge his interest and see if he still wants to rent Spider-Man off of us, which they, of course, did. Tom Holland was cast in the role. He was well received in the Avengers movies. And the Spider-Man movies were also, the new ones, well received. A hell of a lot better than the shitty Garfield movies had been. But now, at least it would seem from outward appearances, that Sony's ownership of the character and their oversight of the character's films have saved Superman from the same fate of being emasculated and then gender swapped that seems to be afflicting all of the other male Avengers. And speaking of swapping genders, I also watched the Matrix movie, and if we could just briefly revisit those woke Oscar protocols. If your sequel is being directed by a woman who was the male co-director of the previous films in the series, how many boxes do you get to check off on the woke Oscar checklist? Do you get to tick the trans box and the woman box? I said woman box. Anyway, as I watched The Matrix Resurrections, which I only did because it was free on HBO Max, there were 2 other movies I found myself reminded of, but they were not the previous Matrix movies. They were 1, Spaceballs, 2, Jay and Silent Bob Strike Back, because both of those films were tongue-in-cheek monuments to movie fandom and merchandising run amok. And so is the Matrix Resurrections. But the problem is, the tongue ain't in the cheek. This film seems to think it can treat its own source material with seriousness and reverence while simultaneously treating its franchise's fan base with something approaching mockery and contempt. But you can't have it both ways. And full disclosure, I have tried several times over the years to make it through the 2nd and 3rd Matrix films with my attention span intact. And it is a task that I have yet to complete. As I sit here today, I don't remember anything about the 2nd movie except the slow motion dancing that seemed to go on for a goddamn hour and a half. And I don't remember anything about the 3rd movie except that Neo got his eyes melted off or something. And the prosthetic they put on him looked absolutely ridiculous. So for the whole 3rd act of the movie, he looks like he's wearing a blindfold that's made out of Nancy Pelosi's neck flesh. The first Matrix, I remember a lot more about that one. But let's face it, that movie entered the public consciousness not because people loved the story or the characters, but because it had a series of striking and memorable visuals that stuck with people after they had exited the theater. Bullet time, the white room, all the guns and the black leather, the kung fu lesson. And bear in mind, that movie happens right at the tail end of the age of filmmaking, where you had to achieve special effects in camera. You had to do the work. You could only rely on computers to a very limited degree. So when they did that bullet time effect, they had to achieve it by setting up 20-odd cameras and timing everything just right so they all exposed in the correct sequence for the correct amount of time. But if you're making that scene even just 2 years later, then you're shooting the picture digitally, and your effects house can create any effect you want within 30 minutes. And to the extent that the story in the first Matrix movie stuck in people's minds, consider the world in which it premiered in 1999. In the United States in that year, fewer than 40% of people were internet users, fewer than 50% had a cell phone. By the time the 3rd movie of that trilogy comes out, which is less than 5 years later, those numbers have risen to 68 and 78% respectively. So in 1999, a story centered around a young man who spends his whole life online, so much that he starts losing the ability to discern between the real world and the digital one. A story like that still seems exotic, vaguely threatening to the average person or the actual moviegoer back then. But today, spending one's whole life online is just what people do. When we first met Thomas Anderson in the first Matrix movie, we were supposed to see his 2 computer monitors and think, wow, that dude's hardcore. He can't even get by on 1 computer monitor. When we saw him asleep at his computer, we were supposed to think, whoa, that dude fell asleep on the internet. He's hardcore. His dial-up bill is going to be crazy high. And can we even call it science fiction anymore? The idea of the world being secretly run by a malevolent machine intelligence, or is it just the regular old world in which we all are accustomed to living? There are some certain forms of fandom that will always escape me, and I think The Matrix is one of them. How much mythology can you build on a foundation that's really just one good movie that was written as a standalone story? And the same thing goes for the Terminator franchise. One good movie, and people have been trying to build a universe out of the damn thing for over 30 years now. And no, in case you're wondering, the really good Terminator movie is not the first one, it's the second one. Which is not to denigrate the first one. It was a real mindfucker seeing that film as a 10-year-old on opening night, let me tell you. It's certainly a good movie with an interesting story, but let's be real here. If Terminator 2 did not exist, Terminator 1 would not be held in nearly as high a regard as it is. It would be a fun artifact of mid-80s cinema and probably little else. The new Matrix film, it has died a real death at the box office, and I can't help wondering how much that owes to the studio, assuming the existence of a loyal and dedicated fan base where no such fan base really exists. Was there anybody clamoring for a new Matrix movie 17 years after the last one that nobody liked? Because I'd never heard it. I was only vaguely aware that there was a new Matrix film coming out until I saw the thing pop up on HBO Max, and then I watched it because it was the day after Christmas and I was bored. Would anything have possessed me to drive to a movie theater and pay money for a ticket for this thing? No. Frankly, I thought it was a rather heroic effort on my part, just remaining awake until the end. But there's one bit that we need to talk about, and in light of who directed the picture, it might get a little bit complicated. So, Keanu Reeves, as mentioned, apparently sold his soul to the devil and stopped aging at 35. But in the context of the film's story, they deal with this in a very convoluted way by another character telling him that the other people actually see him as a crusty old man, and the Matrix is just fooling him into believing that he looks like a mid-30s hipster douchebag. But here's the problem. Carrie-Anne Moss is also in the picture. She's 3 years younger in real life than Keanu Reeves is, but she hasn't made the same dark bargain with Mephistopheles, therefore she's a 54-year-old woman who more or less looks her age. And don't get me wrong, she's still a handsome woman, but when you put her in the same camera frame with Keanu Reeves now, it's difficult to buy that they're lovers rather than mother and son, or much older sister and much younger brother. But for some reason, they decide to deal with the matter head on, and Trinity says, "Look at me. How can I be her?" Meaning, I am so dumpy and middle-aged, I cannot be your fantasy girl, because look at you, Mr. Beefcake. Come any closer, and I'm liable to stuff a dollar bill in your waistband, you stallion. Mama won't be home tonight, kids, because cougar season just started, baby. And as I'm watching this scene play out, I'm thinking, wow, this picture's script actually requires Carrie-Anne Moss to gaze into Keanu Reeves' eyes and say, for all intents and purposes, sir, I am sorry I have aged so much worse than you have. You should not have to be stuck with such an ugly old hag as I. And look, I'm not a professional thespian. I don't even play one on the internet. But if I was Carrie-Anne Moss, and I'm on my first read-through of this script, and I get to the part where I have to tearfully apologize to Keanu Reeves for not being pretty enough, I feel like I'd be on the phone to my agent, screaming, "This is the most sexist shit I have ever seen in a movie script. Get my lawyer on the phone because I am suing that male chauvinist director for everything he is worth." And then the agent says, "Okay, deep breath, sweetie. I love your plan, except it sucks and it's terrible because the director is not a man anymore. So he can't be a male chauvinist." And then Carrie-Anne Moss says, "Shit. That's right. With all the sex changes in this town, it's so damn hard to keep track of who still has their tallywhacker attached." And then the agent says, "Oh man, I could make the best John Wayne Bobbitt joke right now." And that's about it for me tonight, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much indeed for watching. I will be back Wednesday as we steer the ship of the year 2021 to its final berth in the harbor of history. So have a pleasant tomorrow. Do not comply. Get off my lawn.